The mysterious death of Chris Jenkins. Welcome, everyone, to a story filled with mystery and horror. Today, we will explore the disappearance of Chris Jenkins, a college student who vanished without a trace on Halloween night in 2002. Chris's body was found months later in the Mississippi River, still wearing his Halloween costume. Initially, Chris's death was deemed an accident, but as strange details began to emerge, suspicions gradually arose about a mysterious serial killer known as the Smiley Face Killers. Join me as we embark on a journey to uncover the truth behind Chris Jenkins's death. Where shadows and fears lurk everywhere. Are you ready to confront the terrifying secrets this story has to offer? Chapter 1. The Dark Halloween Night. Cheers Bar, with its flickering lights and booming music, was a world of its own on Halloween night in 2002. People were dressed in bizarre costumes, from spooky outfits to cartoon characters, creating a lively yet eerie atmosphere. Chris Jenkins, a 21-year-old college student, felt a thrilling unease as he got lost in the sea of revelers. Dressed in a sparkling prince costume, with a bright red cape and a small crown perched on his head, he stood out. He laughed and joked with friends, downing beers in the air filled with excitement. But something felt off. A strange sensation crept into his mind, as if an unseen shadow was watching him from afar, poised to pounce. When the clock struck 11 p.m., Chris felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. The laughter and music shattered in his head. He stepped away from his friends and out of the bar, leaving the laughter and chaos behind. The night was cold. The wind howled, like an invisible hand pulling him into darkness. Maybe I just need to breathe some fresh air, Chris told himself, trying to shake off the strange feeling clinging to him. He walked down the deserted street, the flickering streetlights casting a hazy glow on everything around him. Under the dim light, Chris's shadow danced, like a silent dance without sound or purpose. But as he approached an intersection, the biting cold wind made him stop. Chris turned back, glancing at the bar he had just left. Everything seemed to fall silent. Only the wind and the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot remained. The feeling of unease swelled in his chest. He felt as if someone was watching him from the darkness, a cold gaze lurking in the shadows of the street. "Is anyone there?" Chris called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. But there was no reply, only the chilling silence. He decided not to turn back and continued forward, but his heart was filled with dread. Then, as he passed a narrow alley, a strange noise made him stop. The rustling of something moving in the darkness, as if someone was hiding in the shadows. Chris held his breath, trying to adjust to the dim light from the street lamp, but he could see nothing clearly. Anxiety surged in his chest like a rising tide. "Don't worry too much," he reassured himself, trying to stay calm. "It's just the wind." But as Chris turned away, the noise sounded again, this time closer, as if an invisible hand was calling his name from the darkness. His unease heightened, and Chris quickly left the alley. He no longer had the desire to find fresh air. His jumbled thoughts were only focused on getting back to the bar, where there was light and noise. But as he approached the bar, everything felt strange again. The once crowded place was now deserted, leaving only the silence and dim lights behind. Chris felt as if he was lost in a world with no end. Time dragged on, and panic rose within him. He decided to call his friends, but there was no signal on his phone. Everything around him seemed to collapse, and a sudden shiver ran down his spine. "I have to do something," Chris muttered, and then, almost instinctively, he decided to step into a nearby cafe, where warm light and soft chatter beckoned. But as soon as he entered, the chill swept over him again. No one noticed him, and the feeling that something was watching him surged back. The world outside felt completely different. Chris felt like a ghost among the crowd. He sat down in a corner and ordered a coffee. The people around him seemed like blurred figures, chatting without realizing his presence. Time passed slowly, each moment stretching into eternity. After finishing his coffee, Chris stood up to leave, but as he stepped out of the cafe, he noticed the atmosphere had changed completely. The strange feeling returned, but this time it was stronger. A strange sound came from behind, causing him to turn around. A shadowy figure stood lurking under the light, but as he tried to get a clearer look, it vanished into the darkness. "No way," Chris gasped, his heart racing faster than ever. He felt like he was being chased by something invisible. Deciding not to look back, Chris ran, running as fast as he could to escape the feeling that was closing in around him. Leaving the cafe, Chris stepped out onto the street. But the noisy sounds had disappeared. Only the terrifying silence remained. He quickly turned around, but everything seemed different. The street was eerily quiet. Not a soul in sight. Time felt like it had stopped, and loneliness enveloped him. As Chris approached the intersection, a cold gust of wind hit him. He looked back toward the alley where he had heard the strange noise earlier. An unsettling feeling rose in his heart, but he felt as if something was pulling him toward the darkness. A compulsion, a force he couldn't resist. "Chris," a voice called out from behind, and he recognized it as one of his friends. But just a moment later, it was too late. Chris turned around, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 2. The Endless Search. The next day, a somber atmosphere enveloped Minneapolis. Everything seemed quieter, and the cold wind carried the anxiety of the Jenkins family. With each passing moment, they felt their hearts growing numb as Chris still had not returned. Prayers and hopes quickly turned into fear as the truth began to reveal itself behind the walls of haunting silence. Margaret, Chris's mother, curled up on the old sofa, her vacant gaze fixed on the window. Almost 24 hours had passed since Chris went missing, and every call, every knock on the door brought only silence to her family. Everything had changed, from joyful family dinners to the suffocating hours filled with worry in a home that was once full of laughter. "We have to do something," Steve, Chris's father, exclaimed in desperation, breaking the silence. "We can't just sit here waiting." Margaret nodded silently, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't just sit here. I have to find my son." She stood up, and the weak winter daylight could do nothing to dispel the anxiety in her heart. Thus, the Jenkins family began their exhausting search. They put up posters with Chris's picture all over the area, from crowded street corners to quiet suburban homes. Those posters were like cries for help, carrying a slim hope that someone might see and remember a little detail about Chris. But with every poster they put up, a feeling of despair mounted. Chris's friends also joined the search. They scoured the streets that Chris usually frequented, asking locals if anyone had seen him on Halloween night. The conversations unfolded in a heavy atmosphere, and everyone's eyes reflected worry and confusion. Though they tried to remain optimistic, fear overshadowed everything. "Maybe he's just out having fun somewhere," one friend said, but his voice was filled with uncertainty. "He'll come back." But none of them truly believed that. Time continued to flow, and the days grew longer. People began experiencing strange feelings, repetitive dreams about Chris, blurry yet haunting images of what might have happened in the darkness. The search dragged on for weeks. Each day, Margaret and Steve returned to the police station to inquire about any new information. But the answers were still cold and devoid of hope. The police reported that they had found no significant clues, and the case was slowly fading from memory. One day, when Margaret visited the police station, she encountered a young officer flipping through a file. "Have they found Chris's body?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. The officer looked up at her, his eyes filled with sympathy. "We're still investigating," he replied, but his voice brought no comfort. Margaret felt despair rising, as if an invisible hand was squeezing her heart. One evening, while everyone else was sound asleep, Margaret couldn't close her eyes. She decided to go outside for a walk around the neighborhood. The sun had set, and the atmosphere was eerily quiet. The sky was pitch black, illuminated only by the dim glow of streetlights. She stopped by the Mississippi River, where Chris had vanished. The water flowed quietly, and the sound of the waves lapping against the shore whispered like secrets. Suddenly, Margaret felt as though someone was watching her. She turned around, but saw no one. Fear surged within her, as if the darkness was creeping closer. Tears welled up in her eyes, and the pain overwhelmed her. "Chris, where are you?" she whispered, hoping her prayer would reach her son. In the following days, the police continued their search, but no new leads emerged. They scoured beaches, parks, but Chris seemed to have vanished like a ghost. Family and friends felt trapped, as if all hope had drained away. As a month passed, people began to doubt the possibility of finding Chris. Investigations started to wane, and the name Chris Jenkins slowly became a memory in the minds of many. But Margaret and Steve couldn't accept the truth. They still hoped, still searched, because Chris wasn't just a name on a missing persons list. He was their son, a part of their family, and they couldn't let the pain of this loss consume them. Halloween had turned into a painful memory, but the anguish was far from over. As the cold winter months dragged on, the Jenkins family refused to give up. They began planning a press conference to draw public attention once again. Hoping that someone might remember something about Chris, they wouldn't let their son's death become an unsolved mystery. They would do whatever it took to uncover the truth. And in the darkness, where fears and doubts accumulated, something began to stir. It seemed the darkness was still lurking, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Chapter 3: The Mysterious Death. When Chris Jenkins's body was brought in, the air in the Hennepin County Coroner's office was thick with heaviness. Margaret and Steve stood outside, their hearts weighed down by thoughts of what might be happening in the lab. They couldn't accept that their son, who had vanished on Halloween night, was now just a cold corpse. This truth felt like a sharp knife stabbing into their hearts. When Dr. Reynolds, the coroner, finally emerged, his face was solemn. "I'm sorry to have to say this," he began, but he didn't need to say much more. Just the look in his eyes was enough for Margaret to feel the world crumbling around her. Chris died of drowning, but there are some strange details we've uncovered. Dr. Reynolds' words pierced through them like a dagger. Chris's death was not just a tragic accident. Margaret felt a jolt of electricity run through her as the doctor continued to explain. "We found bruises on his wrists and arms. This doesn't resemble a typical drowning." Steve, his voice hoarse, asked, "Could this be a murder?" Dr. Reynolds nodded, but he also cautioned, "We need to conduct more tests. Right now, we can't confirm anything." Everything seemed to collapse around the Jenkins family. They felt unable to endure the knowledge that their son's death was not merely an accident. They wanted to know the truth. Every bruise, every mark on Chris's body could be a clue to something more sinister. Starting the next day, Jack, the private investigator they had hired, quickly delved into the strange markings on Chris's body. He knew that to uncover the truth, he needed to examine every detail. From the people who had seen Chris on Halloween night to anyone he might have encountered during that brief time. "We need to learn more about Chris's friends," Jack said, as the family sat in his office. "There may be someone in his group who knows something they haven't shared." Margaret nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope in the darkness. "I'll reach out to Chris's friends," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I won't let anyone forget him." In the following days, Jack conducted interviews with those who had been with Chris on Halloween night. Each testimony gradually unfolded, but everything seemed vague. They clearly remembered Chris leaving with a group of young people none of them recognized. Some mentioned that Chris had been cheerful, but they hadn't seen him afterward. One evening, during a meeting, a friend named Ethan revealed a strange detail. "I remember there was a guy who looked odd, standing close to Chris the entire night. I don't know who he was, but I felt uneasy seeing him." Ethan's eyes were filled with fear. Maybe he was following Chris. Ethan's words struck Jack like a thunderbolt. Could there be someone behind what had happened? Was Chris truly a target in someone's cruel game? Questions swirled in Jack's mind, and he knew he couldn't delay. Jack began searching for information about the stranger Ethan had mentioned. He reviewed the surveillance footage from the bar, but there were no clear signs. The images were blurry, faces blending together in the flickering lights. But nothing could deter Jack. He was determined to investigate and find out who might be responsible for Chris's death. When Jack contacted the police, he emphasized the importance of finding that stranger. But the police could only provide a cold response. "We can't investigate every person without specific evidence," an officer said. A wave of frustration washed over Jack, but he couldn't give up. Chris deserved justice. A week later, Jack received an unexpected call. A woman named Lisa reached out to him. She said she had attended the Halloween party that Chris had gone to. "I felt uneasy when I saw a stranger mingling in the crowd," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "I saw him watching Chris, and when Chris left, he followed." Lisa's story felt like a crucial piece of the larger puzzle. Jack sensed he was getting closer to the truth, even though it was still vague. "Can you describe that person?" Jack asked, filled with hope. "I'm not sure," Lisa stammered, "but I remember he wore a black coat and had a tattoo on his left arm. It looked like a smiling face." A chill ran down Jack's spine upon hearing this. A smiling face. It was not just an innocuous symbol, it could signify something much darker. Jack began to connect the dots, linking this to previous cases and what Lisa had said. Perhaps Chris wasn't a random victim but part of a larger criminal scheme. When Jack shared this information with the Jenkins family, they felt like they were at a crucial crossroads. "We can't let this happen again," Margaret exclaimed, her voice filled with determination. "We must find the truth. Not just for Chris, but for everyone else." These new leads opened a promising yet perilous path. Every question raised new doubts. And in the murky shadows of Minneapolis, an evil force was still quietly at work. The Jenkins family could wait no longer. They had to step into the darkness and confront the horrific secrets that Chris's death had left behind. Chapter 4. Fear explodes. The atmosphere in Minneapolis grew thick, as if an invisible fog was covering everything. Day by day, Margaret and Steve Jenkins, along with Jack, the private investigator, felt the mystery and darkness closing in around them. The new information Lisa provided about the stranger with the smiley face tattoo only intensified their anxiety. A ghost from previous cases now seemed to lurk somewhere among the streets. An upcoming event had everyone in the community on edge. A press conference was being held to draw attention to Chris's death and to engage anyone who might have relevant information. People from all over the area came to learn more about the case. An electric sense of anticipation filled the air, and the scrutinizing eyes made everyone feel like they were in a horror movie. As Jack stood before the crowd, his determination was palpable. "Today, we are not just calling for information about Chris's death. We are seeking help from the community. If anyone saw Chris on Halloween night, or knows anything about the stranger he encountered, please come forward." Jack's words echoed in the quiet space, like the invocation of a curse. The attendees listened intently, but there were also furtive glances exchanged. Some began whispering to each other, their eyes reflecting skepticism and worry. When Jack finished his speech, applause erupted, but it was not strong enough to dispel the heaviness in his heart. Margaret felt her heart race as she scanned the room, trying to find familiar faces. But the truth was, no one could help. As the press conference concluded, people began to disperse. The crowd gradually thinned, leaving only whispers and curious glances behind. A feeling of unease filled the air, and Margaret sensed someone watching her from the shadows. In the following days, news of Chris's case began to spread across the media. Articles, interviews, and images from the press conference surfaced continuously, and the public started to take an interest in the case. But it was also at this moment that strange rumors began to circulate, stories about a group of criminals known as the Smiley Face Killers. A sense of fear permeated everywhere. People in the community began to worry for their own safety. There were meetings in neighborhoods where residents discussed the strange occurrences, and the shadow of Chris's death started to envelop their minds. Children hesitated to go outside alone, while adults always looked around with wary eyes. Margaret couldn't bear the tension any longer. She decided to take action to protect her family and seek the truth. She began organizing meetings with Chris's friends, inviting them over to brainstorm about anyone he might have encountered. She wanted to ensure that no detail was overlooked in their search. One evening, with the lights on in the living room, Chris's friends gathered around the table. Their faces were heavy with sorrow, their eyes filled with anxiety. "We need to remember every detail from Halloween night," Margaret said, trying to spark their recollections. Anything, no matter how small, could be a clue. Ethan, one of Chris's closest friends, felt the weight of responsibility. "I don't know what to do, but there was something off that night," he said, his eyes betraying his worry. "I felt like someone was watching us, like a shadow. We can't let this happen again." Another girl said, "We need to find the truth." The discussions grew lively, but differing opinions began to surface. Some felt they should go to the police and report the group of strange young men Chris had encountered, while others advised caution. That guy could still be nearby, one warned, causing a hush to fall over the room. Finally, they decided they wouldn't just talk but would take action. They would form a volunteer group to gather information and reach out to people living in the area where Chris had disappeared. Margaret felt a glimmer of hope as she looked into the faces of her son's friends. Together, they formed a force. In the days that followed, the volunteer group worked tirelessly. They scoured everywhere, from parks and desolate streets to the bars where Chris used to hang out. Each conversation was fraught with tension, and sometimes sighs of frustration echoed when they found no leads. But one evening, late at night with fog rolling in, Margaret decided to visit the place where Chris had vanished on her own. She wanted to feel again what her son had experienced, to search for a sign, a clue. As she approached the banks of the Mississippi River, Margaret sensed the atmosphere grow heavier. The cold wind howled, and the sound of rushing water became a strange whisper in her ear. Everything around her felt eerie, as if shadows were lurking in the darkness. Watching her every step, she sat down by the riverbank, her gaze fixed on the flowing water. Pain and despair filled her heart. "Chris, where are you?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why haven't you come back?" Why? Little did she know. A pair of eyes were watching from afar, a shadow unseen by anyone. The darkness was waiting, silently observing, like a hungry beast waiting for the chance to pounce. Chapter 5. The Truth Behind the Darkness. As the sunlight gradually faded into night, a deep fear spread within the Jenkins family and Chris's friends. They knew that the battle to uncover the truth about Chris's death had led them into a forest of mystery, where ghosts were not just blurry images but vivid memories of pain and loss. Margaret sat at the dining table, once filled with laughter and joyful stories. She scrolled through pictures of Chris, moments of happiness now haunting reminders. Those photos had become symbols of loss, a reminder of the darkness enveloping the family. As the clues began to become clearer, Jack realized that the investigation was not just about finding a killer. It was also a journey into confronting painful memories, fears, and the pieces of a mystery they couldn't yet fully understand. One afternoon, after hearing information from Chris's friends, Jack decided to dig deeper into the stranger with the smiley face tattoo. He sensed that something was lurking and needed to be brought to light. Jack returned to the bar where Chris had been that night, hoping someone might provide more information about the group of young men Chris had been with. While reviewing security footage, Jack was surprised to find a clip of Chris talking to a young man. The young man's gaze was filled with mystery, as if something unspoken lingered between them. Jack captured the images and decided to question the staff at the bar. They might remember more about what had happened on Halloween night. "Did you see any young men standing near Chris?" Jack asked a young waitress. The girl nodded, her expression puzzled. There was a strange group that arrived after Chris was already there. They seemed odd, especially a man in a black coat. He kept looking at Chris. "Was he the one with the smiley face tattoo?" Jack inquired. The girl furrowed her brow, as if trying to recall. "I'm not sure, but there was one time I saw him smiling weirdly while talking to Chris. It felt like he was trying to get Chris's attention." When Jack returned, he decided to call Margaret and Steve to inform them of his findings. He knew that time was of the essence, and the truth needed to be uncovered. "I think we're getting closer to something," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to find that young man and know exactly who he is." In the following days, Jack and the Jenkins family worked hard to gather information about the strange young man. They returned to the bar and scoured the surrounding areas, asking anyone who had been there on Halloween night. Everyone felt the tension, but their hearts were filled with resolve. Chris deserved the truth. One evening, as Jack sat in his office, an unexpected call came in. On the other end was a familiar voice, Lisa, the girl who had provided initial information about the party. "Jack, I think I saw that guy," Lisa exclaimed, her voice filled with worry. "Where did you see him?" Jack asked, his heart racing. "I saw him at another bar. He was talking to a group of young men, and it looked like they were planning something," Lisa said. "I felt really uneasy seeing him." Jack immediately recognized that this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. He quickly informed the Jenkins family, and they decided to go to that bar that very night. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt heavy, dim lights casting eerie shadows while the sounds of chatter echoed like whispers from the darkness. They searched everywhere, and then, among the crowd, they spotted the young man Lisa had described. He stood near the bar, his black coat stark against the dark surroundings. Jack felt an overwhelming sense of dread. There was something strange about this man, and his presence felt like a warning. "We had to approach him," Steve said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to know what happened to Chris." As they moved closer, the young man turned around, and his gaze met Jack's. Something was off. A chill hung in the air, making everything feel suffocating. Jack sensed a looming threat, like a monster poised to strike. "I want to talk to you," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. The young man merely smiled, but his grin carried no warmth, only a strange obsession. "I don't think there's anything to discuss." "Is there?" he replied, his tone as cold as a winter breeze. Tension filled the air, and people around them began to look their way. "Chris Jenkins," Jack said, unable to contain his rising anger and fear. "We need to know what happened to him." The young man laughed louder, his laughter echoing amid the surrounding noise. "He was just one of many I met. Nothing special about him." Jack felt his rage boiling over. "You don't know what you're talking about," he shouted, feeling as if everything was spiraling out of control. But the young man just shook his head, his eyes vacant. "Be careful. There might be things you don't want to know," he said, then turned and walked away. Jack felt a shadow loom over him, and in that moment, a terrifying fear surged within. They had touched on something far greater, something buried deep within the darkness. As they left the bar, they were filled with mixed emotions. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. "We need to be vigilant. If he's really connected to Chris's death, we have to find evidence." Unanswered questions returned, and a strange feeling washed over them. Perhaps what they were searching for was not just the truth about Chris's death, but also their survival in a world filled with darkness and mystery. The unseen forces might be watching, and they had to be ready to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The story of Chris Jenkins's death has uncovered many mysteries and fears within us. As his family and friends relentlessly search for the truth, they also confront the shadows lurking around them. Was Chris truly a random victim? Or had he been caught up in a deadly game played by criminals? The fight for the truth is not just about bringing justice for Chris, but also about protecting other souls who may fall into a similar fate. If you found this story chilling and captivating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next horror stories. Thank you for listening, and always stay cautious, because the darkness never truly disappears.